Okay, good morning. We are going to be talking about Chapter 5 today, and we'll continue Chapter 5 on Friday, so you might want to read in particular Section 8 in Chapter 5 for Friday. Now, you have homework that is due Friday, 2 days from now, on Chapter 4. So, does anybody have any questions about the homework on Chapter 4? You know, it's the one that usually causes students the most difficulty is problem 41. Problem 41 is very similar to the problem that we solved in solving the diffusion equation to try to find the biggest size of a cell from diffusion of oxygen. The main difference between what we were doing in class and what the homework problem asks is the boundary conditions. So you won't be able to assume even and odd functions, so your best guess is something like ax squared plus bx plus c, and the boundary conditions are somewhat different than what we use. They're different on the two sides of the I. So that one in particular, pay attention to. The rest should be fairly straightforward. Then you'll have another homework assignment over Chapter 5, which will be due a week from Friday. So I listed what the problems are, but we'll just begin talking about that today. And one thing I forgot to mention is, if you're looking for a good little book on diffusion, I recommend Random Walks in Biology by Howard Berg. It discusses diffusion at about the level that we talk about it here in class, but it really talks about how it applies to biology. Excellent book if you're looking. It's not required reading in any way, but if you're finding some of the diffusion ideas difficult, this might be a good source to take a look at. All right, so Chapter 5 is going to be mainly about osmotic pressure. So in order to talk about osmotic pressure, the first thing we have to talk a little bit about is just what pressure is. So suppose you had a cylinder, and at the end of the cylinder is a piston. And we want to try to figure out what the pressure is on that piston from the gas inside. Well, it's useful to just think about it microscopically. There's all these gas molecules moving around in random directions. And some of them will move and hit the piston and bounce back. And those are going to exert a force on the piston. As they change their momentum, they'll be banging it and tend to knock the piston to the right. So if you have all those particles, the total number of particles that are hitting the piston is going to really give you something that determines the pressure. All the particles are moving more or less at the same speed because you're at a constant temperature. So if you're at a fixed temperature, it really just depends on how many of these particles you have as to what sort of the size of the pressure is. So now let's take a look at a special case of, instead of having a piston, we have something called a semi-permeable membrane. So let's look at a box. And in the box you have this semi-permeable membrane. And what's that mean? That means that some molecules can go through it and some can't. In particular, we're going to assume that water molecules can go through the semi-permeable membrane, and perhaps small ions can. But large protein molecules or some sort of large molecule can't go through the membrane. So it really depends on the particular type of semi-permeable membrane you have as to what molecules go through and what can't. So initially, we're going to set this up like this. We're going to have some water molecules on this side. We're just going to draw 8 of them. 5, 6, 7, 8. And we're going to have water molecules on this side. But inside, amongst the water molecules, we're going to have some big, say, protein molecules or some sort of large molecule that can't go through the semi-permeable membrane. Now, what happens if we watch this over time? So here we have 4 water molecules and 4 of the big protein molecules. Okay, over over time, what's going to happen? Well, what we have is we have a concentration gradient in the water. Because I'm trying to draw this so that the two sides were the same size. Same size, this has more water molecules than over here. So just by diffusion, you'd expect the water to diffuse down this concentration gradient. So you're going to end up getting, instead of having 8 water molecules here and 4 here, you're going to end up getting 6 water molecules on both sides just from the diffusion. Now you might also think, well, these big proteins have a huge concentration gradient going the other direction. But they can't get through the semipermeable membrane. So you still have 4 of these over here, and they can't pass through. So now look what's happening. Now you have pushing on this semipermeable membrane. From this side, you have 6 water molecules, and they're going to go in, bump into the semipermeable membrane, and bounce off and exert a force. But you also have a total of 8. So you have 6 water molecules here, you have 6 water molecules, and still you have your 4 proteins, a total of 10. 10 molecules bouncing off of this side. So these are going to be coming in here and bouncing off, and so are these. And you have a bigger force, so a bigger pressure on this side than this side. So it's going to tend to exert a pressure on the semipermeable membrane. This is what's called the osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure is just the buildup. You can think of it this way. You can think of the high concentration side sucking the water out of the low concentration side and end up building up a larger pressure. So if you had a situation like this where you had a couple of tubes coming up here, then the water is going to end up going up the tube, and it's going to be a higher pressure over here and a lower pressure over here, because you're going to have a hydrostatic pressure counterbalancing this osmotic pressure. So there'll be a difference in height from the two sides because there will be a difference in pressure. So I'll call this delta H because it's the difference in height between side 1 and side 2. Now, how are we going to calculate what that pressure is? Well, the pressure, really the water pressure, is basically the same on each side. It's these big particles that bang into the semipermeable membrane that really causes the extra pressure, the osmotic pressure. And we're going to assume that the concentration of these is not extremely high. So I've exaggerated it here, but there's fairly low concentration so that the big protein particles act a little bit like an ideal gas. So, the ideal gas has the following equation. PV equals NKT. Where now P is going to be the partial pressure of these protein molecules. V is the volume on this side. N is the number of these protein molecules. K is our Boltzmann's constant, and T is the absolute temperature. It obeys essentially the equation of ideal gas. Now, the nice thing is if you take and you just divide through by the volume, you get N over V KT, and N over V is just the concentration. So you get concentration KT for the pressure. And this is usually referred to as the osmotic pressure. You can give it the symbol pi, and that's just because the part of the pressure on the cylinder, on the semipermeable membrane, that's due to the particles that cannot cross it, is what we call the osmotic pressure. And it's concentration times Boltzmann's constant times the temperature. And sometimes you'll see this written as little c, where little c is equal to big C over Avogadro's number, because little c is moles per unit volume. And then K, or you'll then write R, gas constant, and remember gas constant is Avogadro's number times Boltzmann's constant. So all I really did is multiply and divide by Avogadro's number, so just by 1, and then temperature. So you often see it written this way instead of this way, but they're totally equivalent. The osmotic pressure is the molar concentration, gas constant, times the temperature. And that's sometimes called Van Hoff's law. Chemists would typically call it that. But it's really the ideal gas law, just in disguise. So, let us look at, well, first of all, questions on this. Questions on osmotic pressure. Yeah.
What did the V stands for?
The V would be the volume. It'd be the V is the volume on this side here. I've tried to draw it so both of them have the same volume. Yeah.
You said it behaves like a gas or a liquid.
It behaves, well, these individual particles, which are of a fairly low concentration, would behave a lot like an ideal gas because they aren't really interacting with each other much. They're interacting with the fluid around them, but they are kind of act like separate particles that will occasionally hit this wall, just like a gas would. You can't really treat the water as an ideal gas because it is much more dense and is going to have fluid motion. All right, so this is a little bit of a simplistic view of osmotic pressure, but it's a useful view. It gets the essence of what's going on without too many complications. All righty, so let us get rid of this. And let's see if we can put some numbers to some of this. Okay, so I want to look at problem 5.4. This was not on your homework, but it's one to look at. So chapter 5, problem 4. If osmotic pressure in human blood is 7.7 atmospheres at 37 degrees C, what is the solute concentration? So, the question says, the pressure, osmotic pressure, so we'll call it I, is equal to 7.7 atmosphere. Well, you're going to be able to use, it depends, I guess, on what you use for R. If you use the value of R, it contains atmospheres, you could just use 7.7. But if we're going to use sort of MKS units, I'm going to ultimately use this expression. So if I want to get the pressure, the osmotic pressure, it's going to be involved. I need to convert that to pascals. So pascals is basically 10 to the 5th pascals in an atmosphere. So this becomes 7.7 times 10 to the 5 pascals. Okay, so I'm going to use this one with Boltzmann's constant. So we need to remember what that is. 1.4 times 10 to the minus 23. That would be joules per Kelvin. Temperature. The problem said temperature is 37 degrees, body temperature. But you got to remember that when you're dealing with the ideal gas law, that's absolute temperature there. So we really have to convert it to Kelvin, which becomes 310 Kelvin, 273 plus the Celsius temperature. All right, so what we can now do is calculate the concentration, which is going to be pressure over kT, which is going to be 7.7 times 10 to the 5th. Pascals. Pascal is a Newton per meter squared, divided by 1.4 times 10 to the minus 23. That's joules. A joule is a Newton meter. Work is force times distance. Meter over Kelvin times 310 Kelvin. Okay, so the Kelvins cancel, the Newtons cancel, and you're going to be left with really number of molecules, which is sort of implicit in this, you're really left with per unit volume. So that's a concentration. It's going to be number of molecules, so dimensionless number per unit volume. So if you go through and you do this calculation, you get So this 23, minus 23 comes up and becomes really big when you bring it upstairs. So you get 1.8 times 10 to the 26 molecules per meters cubed. Okay, now almost nobody's going to think of it that way. Usually when you're thinking of concentrations, you want to do two things. First of all, you want to write it in moles, because moles is usually much more familiar. So you're going to take that and you're going to multiply by 1 mole is Avogadro's number, 6 times 10 to the 23 molecules per mole. And when you multiply that through, 10 to the 26, 10 to the 23 becomes 1,000. 1,000, a little bit less than 1 times 1,000, that becomes 300. Or actually, 300 moles per meters cubed. But also, we were thinking at least concentration in terms of sort of chemist units. They're almost never going to use meters cubed. It's almost always going to be liters. So there are 1,000 liters. Actually, I should be dividing. There's 1 meters cubed is 1,000 liters. And so this gives you, instead of 300, 0.3 moles per liter. Now, what usually you'll see this is when you're talking about concentrations with osmotic pressure, all the different types of molecules that can't go through the semi-permeable membrane will contribute. So usually, if you were talking about concentration of just say sodium ions, you'd calculate the concentration, you talk about it in moles per liter. But if you're talking about all the molecules that can't go through the semi-permeable membrane, usually you express it in what's called an osmole. An osmole is just a mole of stuff that can't go through this semi-permeable membrane. So there's not much difference in the meaning. It's just one refers to a specific ion and the other one refers to all the stuff that can't go through. So this then becomes 0.3 osmole, because a mole is a osmolar concentration, or in other words, 300 milliosmol. 300 milliosmol of concentration. And this is the number that you probably ought to remember, because a lot of concentrations of biological molecules are given in millimolar. For instance, if you have a bag of saline, it's basically saline is basically water with sodium chloride, salt poured in. And in a bag of normal saline, you have about 150 millimolar of sodium. But you also have about 150 millimolar of chlorine. And if neither of those can go through a semi-permeable membrane, then you have 300 millimolar of milliosmol of osmotic pressure. So normal saline basically has this concentration in it. You don't include the water. Water presumably can pass through the semi-permeable membrane. So there's a couple things to remember. First of all, this is just your standard osmotic pressure for normal body fluids. And when you have an ion such as sodium chloride, when you have a salt and it can break into two, you have to add up all the contributions from all the constituents so that it goes for both sodium and for chlorine. All right, so that was the question, was what was the concentration, and we calculated it. So your body regulates its osmotic pressure in its blood, and it keeps it right around 300 milliosmol, and it's actually sort of very important to not let that osmotic pressure get out of whack. Okay, questions on that? Let us look at another problem, and this one's also not in your homework, but it's problem 5.2. So 5.2 says, protein concentration in serum is made of two main, that's not it, here. Protein unit conversions, perform unit conversions to verify that the value of R in two different units are equivalent. So you'll sometimes see the gas law written as 8.31 joules per mole Kelvin. And you'll sometimes see the gas law written as 0.082 atmospheres liters per mole Kelvin. And we want to show that those are the same thing. Well, all we got to do is do the conversions. So we will take a joule, which is going to be a joule is a Newton meter, and you're taking then that can be written as Newton meters squared per meters cubed. So it's a Pascal per meter cubed. So what we can do is if we want to turn it into atmosphere, we can convert from Pascal, as in Pascal meters cubed. So that's what a joule is. So we have pascals and we want to convert to atmospheres. The conversion factor is 1 atmosphere, and we're going to be really accurate. This is actually 1.01 times 10 to the 5th Pascal. And we have meters cubed, and we want to get to liters. So we're going to have 1,000 liters per meters cubed. So you have a 10 to the 3rd and a 10 to the 5th. So that becomes a 10 to the 2 downstairs, something slightly over 1. So if you move the decimal point over 2 spots, and you reduce it slightly because 1% lower, you get exactly this R in atmospheres and liters. So it works. It's just a matter of what units you want to use. You'll often see chemists using this expression. All right, so let us see now what else we got on there. This is problem 5.6, and problem 5.6 is in the homework, so we'll talk a little bit about it, get it started for you. 5.6. 5.6 says, a person is given an intravenous fluid. The solute concentration of fluid must be matched to the solute concentration of blood to avoid problems arising from a change in blood's osmotic pressure. One such fluid is called isotonic saline. It can be made by adding salt to distilled water. And the osmolarity of the blood is about 0.3 osmol, which would be 300 milliosmol. So how many grams of sodium chloride do you have to add to pure water? So this is something exactly like when I was in graduate school. I used to do experiments, and we'd put a nerve in a dish and surround it by saline, and then we'd do our experiment. And the saline, it's a little more complicated than just pure salt water, sodium chloride. We're going to pretend it's just pure sodium chloride. So basically, you pour out a liter of pure water, and then you just measure out a certain amount of salt on your balance, and then you dump that in. And the question is, how much salt? So what you're going to need to do this, first of all, you need to know the concentration. And like we said, sodium chloride or salt will break into sodium and chloride. So if you want to get a total osmotic pressure, you need to have equal amounts of both, which means instead of having 300 milliosmol, you're going to have 150 of sodium, 150 of chlorine. So all you have to do then is go and figure out what 1 mole, basically, or 0.3 moles, so that would be 0.15 moles of sodium, how much mass that is, and 0.15 moles of chlorine and how much mass that is, because that will give you the total mass of salt you put in. So you'll need the molecular weight. The molecular weight basically gives you the number of grams per mole of the substance. So you look up the molecular weight of sodium, you look up the molecular weight of chlorine, you can go through and you can then calculate how much of each you need and the total amount of salt you need to put in order to create saline. So if you ever go and get hired by a saline manufacturing company, it's really an easy manufacturing process. Weigh out the sodium chloride, dump it in the water. All you really got to do is not screw up the amount of sodium chloride you put in. So this will be your exercise to do that. And then there is a second part of the problem where you're asked to make isotonic dextrose solution. So you want to put in sugar. And it also has to have the osmotic pressure match the blood, which is about 0.3 about 300 milliosmoles. The thing about sugar is when you put the sugar, I mean, sugar looks a lot like salt when you take it out. It's a crystal, fairly clear substance. When you dissolve it, sugar just breaks apart into individual sugar molecules, but it doesn't ionize. It doesn't dissociate into a plus part and a minus part. It's just a piece. So you really want to have 300 millimolar of the sugar as opposed to 150 millimolar of sodium and 150 millimolar of chlorine. So when it doesn't ionize, you have to do it slightly differently. So you're just going to figure out, you have to get the molecular weight of the sugar, and sugar is C6O6H12. Usually it's not in that order, but that's what it amounts to. So you have to look up those molecular weights just to figure out how much sugar to put into your water. All right, so that one's fairly straightforward, how you make saline. And then after you pour this little bit of salt into this water, then you sell it for $50 a liter in the drugstore or something. It's a little ridiculous, but I guess you're making sure it's pure and there's no bacteria or anything in it. But let's go on. Problem 5.3. 5.3, and that's also in your homework. Okay. The protein concentration in serum is in the blood, is made up of two main components, albumin and globulin. So this is 5.3, albumin and globulin. Those are the two main big proteins in the blood. So if you want to figure out how much they contribute to the osmotic pressure, what you really have to do is you have to calculate basically their concentration. And the concentration is it's given as grams per milliliter, per 100 milliliters. So you're given how many grams, and you have to calculate the concentration, so you'll need this molecular weight, but the molecular weight's given in the problem. So all you really have to do in this problem is go through and figure out what the osmotic pressure is due to each constituent. So it's kind of useful because in your blood vessels, especially in the capillaries, not only can water cross the capillary wall fairly easily, but just about all the ions, sodium, chlorine, all the small ions. I think even almost most of the small molecules can cross the capillary, but the big proteins certainly can't. So when you're talking about the osmotic pressure, you're often worried about the osmotic pressure difference. And if sodium and chloride and all the other ions can cross the capillary membrane, then it's got the same osmotic pressure inside and outside. So it doesn't really make much difference to you because it's all the same pressure, whether it's a high or low osmotic pressure. But for the proteins, you definitely have only can be inside the blood vessel, and they're not basically outside, so that you can have they contribute seriously to the osmotic pressure, and so you can calculate those. So that's the idea, and it's kind of interesting with these blood proteins, because if a person is in a famine situation where they don't have much to eat, their levels of protein will go down, which means the osmotic pressure from these proteins in their blood will go down. So what happens if the osmotic pressure goes down? Well, suppose you added something to the blood, so it had a higher concentration in the blood. That sort of sucks water out of the tissue into the blood. If If you reduce the concentration, that does just the opposite. It kind of leaks water, and water that would normally be held in the blood by osmotic pressure is no longer held in the blood. It goes into the space between the cells, the extracellular space, and you get what's called edema, buildup of water in the extracellular space. And you can sometimes get these horrible pictures of children who have been in extreme famine areas, and they look like they're big and fat, and that's because water, their protein levels have gotten so low that water just leaks out of their blood vessels into the surrounding tissue, and it's almost all water that they're filled up with. It's not that they have a lot of fat; they're just bloated with water, and then it's a problem. And eventually, if they don't have a high enough protein concentrations, they could die. So you can get all sorts of odd things happening if your protein, if your osmotic pressure gets out of whack. All right, problem 5. Another problem with that's in your homework. Okay. 5.5. Suppose, well, we don't have to suppose. I can tell you an actual story that happened to my mom. She was walking along and she fell and hit her head. She ended up in the emergency room and intensive care. And when you head in your head and you start getting blood vessels bleeding in your head, you're basically the pressure in your brain begins to build up. Problem with pressure in your brain is that your skull is a fixed volume. There's nowhere to expand. If your pressure builds up in your leg, well, your leg just swells. You can't swell when you're inside a skull. Okay, so pressure builds up in your brain and it can be fatal. I mean, it could easily, if it builds up too high, begin to push on your brain stem, practically push the brain right out of the skull cavity. So you have to solve that very quickly. One way to do it is to put in a substance called mannitol. Mannitol. Let's see how you spell that. Mannitol. And mannitol is kind of like glucose, but it's slightly different. And the thing about mannitol is it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. Regular glucose can cross it fairly well. But mannitol is just different enough from glucose that it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So what happens is you inject the person with mannitol, it builds up the osmotic pressure in the blood. And then as the blood goes through the brain, it sucks water out of the brain, and thereby reducing the pressure in the brain. So it's a very effective treatment for building up pressure in the brain. And it's what they did to my mom, and she managed to get by okay from the fall. There's one problem with mannitol. That is, it's not true that it does not cross the blood-brain barrier. It's just very slow at crossing the blood-brain barrier. So if you give somebody mannitol over many days, eventually the mannitol will tend to cross the blood-brain barrier, and it'll sort of equilibrate so it'll have the same concentration in the blood as in the brain. Then suppose you say, okay, crisis over, we'll take this person off the mannitol. Well, now you no longer have the mannitol in the blood, but where is it? It's in the brain, and it's really slow to leach out. So at that point, you now are sucking water into the brain, so you can cause headaches, you can cause problems, because mannitol then has to slowly go out of the brain over several days. So mannitol is a very useful way to treat high brain pressure, but it's only useful mainly as a temporary. If you use it for too long, for days, you begin to kind of defeat your purpose. It no longer works very well, and then when you take it off, it causes even more problems. So that's just a little story about how these osmotic effects can actually affect medical treatment. So if you're ever with somebody who is in the hospital and you see them, what they'll usually do is they'll hook up a bag of saline, and inside the saline they'll just have, 100 milliosmol of mannitol that work sucking out the water in the brain. Okay. Now, I want to point out a little bit about capillaries and how they work, because capillaries, we saw last time, had a Peclet number that was around 1, which meant that diffusion and convection both contributed. So I want to kind of show you how this happens and how water flows in the capillary. So this is the arterial side. This is the venous side. And this is the capillary itself connecting the two. Now, there is a pressure drop across the capillary. High pressure in the arteries and the heart, low pressure in the veins. So you have a high pressure over here. This is pure hydrostatic pressure now what we're talking about. And a lower pressure over there. Just because you have to drive flow through the resistive capillaries, just like we talked about Posay flow in chapter 1. There's also these proteins in the blood. And they provide a osmotic pressure. But the osmotic pressure is about the same on both sides, because the proteins don't leak out. So over here on the arterial side, you have a fairly high hydrostatic pressure and a modest to medium osmotic pressure. So if you're actually going to have water flowing out of the capillary into the extracellular fluid, because the hydrostatic effect is stronger than the osmotic effect. You don't usually have this in arteries and veins upstream because they've got big, thick walls and you can't really pass water through them very easily. But the thin-walled capillaries, water will come out. Over here, you've lost your hydrostatic pressure. Compared, especially these pressures are all compared to the outside. You've lost your hydrostatic pressure, but you still have your osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure is going to suck the water back in. So what you have is as your blood flows down the capillary, it's got this natural convection which carries the fluid out into the extracellular space and then sucks it back in. So it really provides a nice convective flow. And this is one reason why capillaries don't have to rely entirely on diffusion. You could have some diffusion of, say, oxygen here where it just diffuses across and gets out here. But it can be carried by convective flow. And both of those processes are important in the capillaries. So just wanted to show you another example of osmotic pressure. Okay. Any questions on any of this? No? Alrighty. Let us look at another case. Now, a lot of you are in the bioengineering program, and bioengineers often build devices. So one device I want to talk about now is the artificial kidney. Because the artificial kidney uses these ideas of osmotic pressure. So we're talking about dialysis. So anybody have a relative who may be on dialysis? You don't have to answer if you don't want to. But it's a fairly common. It's when you have your kidney failure. So your kidney is responsible for basically getting the correct concentrations of ions in the blood and getting rid of waste products. Waste products build up in your blood and they'll get taken out by the kidney, and then you'll pee them out, and that's your urine. So when your kidney ceases to function, you have to have an artificial way to do that, and that's the artificial kidney. It works by dialysis. So, it's a fairly common thing. There's about 500,000 dialysis procedures every day in the United States. Every year. Every year, 500,000. So it's not a real rare condition. So what do? Well, you take blood, so you're going to have to hook the person up, have a needle in their arm, taking the blood out. So you got blood on this side, and you're going to have a semi-permeable membrane, and then you're going to have your dialysis fluid on this side. And you're going to want to then let the blood, some molecules will be able to cross easily, some will be blocked. You're going to set up your dialysis fluid exactly like you want your blood to be, and then you'll have the ions and things will cross over into the blood, and you can then essentially your toxins and your waste products will move into the dialysis fluid, and you can wash them out. So that's the general idea. And what you need is a semi-permeable membrane. You want the semi-permeable membrane to pass a lot of things. You want it to pass water. You want it to pass about all the ions, especially sodium, potassium, chlorine, all the major ions, calcium. You want it to pass glucose and some other small things. In particular, you want it to you might know what the most common waste molecule is in your body. Not so much talking about gases. Gases get taken care of in the lungs, like CO2. But what fluid-soluble waste product can you think of?
Urea.
Urea. It's what makes basically your urine look yellow. I think that's right. Urea is another molecule you want to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Urea is, in fact, C double bond O, NH2, and H2. It's how you get rid of a lot of nitrogen from your body. Okay, but you don't want it to pass big proteins like your albumin, your globulin. You don't want it to cross red blood cells to cross the membrane. So you got to have a membrane that passes small molecules, not large ones. What I want to do now is I want to try to set up a differential equation that can describe the dialysis procedure. So let us try this. You're going to have a certain concentration in the blood, which is going to change with time because your whole goal of dialysis is to change the concentration. Let's focus on urea as just one example, the concentration of urea. And you're going to have also a certain concentration C0 in the dialysis fluid. For urea, you probably make it 0. But if you were looking at, say, glucose, you might want to have some glucose in there. So that'll be some constant. And you're going to assume that this is a fixed constant, which means you're going to be kind of constantly washing this dialysis fluid. So if it begins to build up in here, you wash it out and you put in some new so that your concentration of your dialysis fluid is constant. Now, what we're going to need to do is we need to figure out how much per unit area, per unit time is going through. And we're going to call that J. That will be, in our case, for urea, how much urea per unit area, per unit time. And you sometimes write this as omega, which is going to be basically some property of the membrane itself. It's called the permeability. Times, well, what else do you have? You have a concentration difference, C of T minus C0. And usually there's a factor of RT, just from the way permeability is defined, you end up getting a factor of RT in this expression. So, and that really arises from the osmotic pressure equation, because this just talks about how easy you can go across the membrane, and the osmotic pressure is basically going to have the RT, so it gets built into this expression. That's how much per unit area, per unit time. Now, suppose we want to see how much the blood concentration, how many molecules, let's see how many molecules leave the blood as a function of time. So let's see, dN dt. N is going to be the number of urea molecules over here in the blood. Okay, that's going to be what? This is the number, the only place they can go is across the membrane. So this is number per unit area per unit time. So they're going to decrease if they go out, and they'll have J, and then you have to multiply by the area of the membrane. And that's basically, that's a concentration law. It says if, continuity equation, if they're going through the membrane, they're not coming in from any other sides. So if they're going out through the membrane, they are changing its concentration. Now, if you want to talk about a change in the number, that's really related to the change in concentration. Because concentration is number per unit volume. So dN dt would be the same as V times dC dt. That tells you the change in the number of molecules is minus J, and J, well, there's the A. J had omega C minus C naught RT. I gotta get rid of this other stuff here. All right, so we're almost there. Let's just divide 2 by the volume. You get dC dt equals minus A omega RT over V C minus C naught. And what we've done is we've just reasoned out a differential equation that governs dialysis. Tells you how the concentration in the blood changes as a function of time. All right, does this look familiar to anybody? Have you seen that equation before? Well, it's basically has one term where the change is proportional to the concentration itself, and another term is essentially a constant. This is the same as when we let something fall under friction, in air friction, and it goes to terminal velocity. It's the same as Newton's law of cooling. We've seen it several times. We're going to see it other times. It's essentially our differential equation. We can write it this way if you want. dc dt is equal to minus C minus C0 over V over A omega RT. All I did is took this A omega RT that's upstairs and put it in denominator to denominator. Why would I do such a thing? You'll often see this differential equation written as dc dt equals minus C naught over a time constant. Because if you ignore this constant term, that's just the equation I told you. If there's only one you can solve, it's this. It gives you an exponential, and the exponential is time constant tau. And if it's steady state, it gives you C equals C0. So in steady state, in the long term, if you do this dialysis and you just wait for a long time, you're eventually going to get C equals C0. So you set up the dialysis fluid the way you want the blood to eventually be. And the blood will approach the concentration of dialysis fluid. And if you wanted for urea, you might set C0 equal to 0, so the blood would just approach 0 urea. And this is going to be the time constant involved in the how it approaches equilibrium. So let us look and see if we can calculate what a typical time constant would be for dialysis. And we need some of these parameters. First of all, oftentimes a membrane will be specified not just in terms of its permeability omega, but omega times RT. All that will go in, and so you buy a membrane from the membrane store, and they'll specify this. And cellophane is 5 times 10 to the minus 6, and that whole thing just has units of meters per second. So that's cellophane. Cellophane is not necessarily what's used in a lot of membranes nowadays, but it is one material that has a lot of small holes that can pass some molecules but not others. Okay, you need to know the A, the area. Well, you want to have a large area. So oftentimes you'll have like 2 square meters worth of area where you're going to have this flow occurring by. And volume, well, this is essentially your blood volume. So you're going to have a volume which is many liters, say 40 liters. That actually might include some of the extracellular fluid that gets mixed in with the blood. As your blood gets rid of the urea will then come in from your extracellular fluids. So you only have, I think, like 5 liters of blood, but you have maybe 40 liters of extracellular fluid, and that's the fluid, the volume you're going to be dealing with when you're figuring out the volume that you're undergoing dialysis with, which could be written as 0.04 meters cubed. So let's calculate this time constant. Okay, it's V, so 0.04 meters cubed over omega RT is 5 times 10 to the minus 6 meter per second, and the area was 2 meters squared. So meters cubed cancels the meters cubed, and the seconds comes up, so the answer is going to be in seconds. And this is a small number, but this is really small, at 10 to the minus 6. It's going to come up and be, just a second, 0.04 times 10 to the 5th seconds, which is about 4,000 seconds, which means you're talking 67 minutes. And that's just one time constant. Remember, the exponential will fall off to 1 over e of its value in one time constant. So if you want to get rid of not just 1/3 of the urea, but you want to get rid of like 95% of it, you got to wait several time constants. So what we're talking about is a dialysis taking several hours. So a person will typically go in to dialysis maybe on Monday, sit there for several hours in the afternoon, have their blood equilibrated with the dialysis fluid, and then they're good to go until the waste products build up again, which might not be until Wednesday. They'll go and do a dialysis again, and then maybe on Friday. So maybe 3 times a week they're spending an afternoon just sitting there with the dialysis fluid. It's not a great solution. The other alternative is a kidney transplant, which also has its own set of problems. Transplants are always difficult. Body rejects material. You have to suppress the immune system. There's no real good solution for kidney failure. But dialysis can extend life. You can do this for years. Eventually your body begin to wear down, but dialysis can maintain quality of life fairly good for many years going into doing dialysis, or maybe for months while you're waiting for a kidney to become available for transplant. So that's one of the processes. Really, one of the big contributions of engineering to medicine is the artificial kidney. Okay, there are some stories about the artificial kidney. First of all, the very first one was designed by a man named Willem Kolff. And he was in the Netherlands. And amazing as this sounds, he was in the Netherlands during World War II when he designed the first artificial kidney. Well, if you know much about the history of Europe, Netherlands were invaded by Germany during World War II. So Netherlands were occupied by a foreign power, and he was going into his lab. He was also involved somewhat in the resistance against the Nazis, but he would go into his lab and he was building this first artificial kidney. So if you think that you can't make great contributions because, your situation's kind of hard, well, just think of this poor guy who's doing this on his own. He used sausage membrane. Membrane just like you use for sausage, he used as his semi-permeable membrane. And he had basically a big vat which covered by a layer of the sausage. He had a stirring rod that would stir the fluid, and he'd pour the blood in, and he'd have the blood going out and going in and mixing with the dialysis fluid, and he was able to keep people alive by this artificial kidney. So, it was really kind of crude at the start, but it worked. Now, there's some things, anytime engineers are tackling problems, what they'll usually do is they'll divide something, and then they start looking at what the problems are, and then they fix the problems. So they got a better device, but now they see there's new problems. So here's some of the problems that can come up. First of all, you got to take the blood out of the body, send it through the dialysis machine, put it back in the body. Blood tends to clot. That's why if you get a cut, it'll stop bleeding because the blood clots. Well, the blood's going to clot as it goes through this process. So typically, you got to take the blood out and immediately give it something like heparin or some kind of anti-clotting factor so that the blood can go through the dialysis okay. And then once you get done and it goes back in the body, you can't have the person walking around with no ability to clot. So you got to put in another drug which sort of turns the heparin off and takes out the heparin or inactivates it. So there's a lot of blood clotting issues that go along with dialysis. You want to have this time constant fairly short because you don't want the person just sitting there forever. So which means you want to have a large, small volume in a big area. So you don't really want to make this. There's 2 ways you could imagine doing dialysis. You can send the blood through a big tube surrounded by the dialysis fluid. But you're much better off sending the blood through a whole bunch of little tubes. Each one in contact with the dialysis fluid because you get more surface area for a given volume. So a lot of the tricks with dialysis and the membrane design is to try to increase surface area without increasing the volume and making the machine too big. So there's a lot of tricks with membranes to do that. There is, let's see, where's some of the other, okay, another problem with urea in particular is urea is a little bit like mannitol. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier very well. So let's picture what happens when you go in and your urea concentration is built up and you go up for dialysis. Well, your urea gets taken out of the bloodstream fairly easily through dialysis, but it's still up in the head. So you have a higher concentration of urea in the brain than in the blood. So what's going to happen? What? Edema, but edema the wrong direction. It's going to be tending to water flow into the brain where the high concentration of urea is. But the brain can't expand, so you get pressure build up in the brain. And it's not huge amounts of pressure, but it's enough to give headaches. So dialysis can give headaches if done too rapidly. So you're sort of limited. Remember when we were limited in elevators because of changes in air pressure? Well, kind of the same thing in dialysis. You can't change the concentration of urea and some of the other waste products too quickly, or you induce problems with headaches because of buildup of pressure in the brain. So you can't reduce this down to a 5-minute procedure just because of that. It's got to take some time to keep you from getting big headaches. Okay, the final problem with dialysis is that, let's think what we do here. We're making a fluid, and you're probably going to want to keep it warm, because at least you want to have the blood warm when it goes back in. You want to have it have a lot of sodium and potassium and chlorine ions, and you want to have a lot of glucose, because you want to keep the glucose up in the blood. So what are you making? You're basically making a culture for bacteria. I mean, this is exactly where bacteria want to live. So you have to be very careful to not allow bacteria to start growing in your dialysis fluid. So usually that means you end up using a whole lot of dialysis fluid as you flush it by. But dialysis fluid is sort of the ideal culture for bacteria. So that's another problem. So that's a little bit about the artificial kidney. It's pretty much, engineers have solved most of the problems. It works fairly well over medium lengths of times, months, a few years, over decades. It begins to, your body just has trouble with it. Okay, couple other things we want to talk about before we go. This one's kind of important because, as we've found, not so much medicine, but we're all having trouble with rising sea levels, and it could infiltrate and basically cause some of our water supplies to get infested with salts. So we gotta have a way to get fresh water. You can get fresh water. I mean, you could boil the water and then distill it, basically, and you can get pure water. That takes a lot of energy to boil the water. Here's another way to get fresh water. So we're going to have a little tap here, and that's where the water is going to come out. And we're going to put a piston here, and we're going to put a semi-permeable membrane here. And we're going to put in seawater. So it has a big osmotic pressure because it's all salty. And this semi-permeable membrane, we're going to select one that does not pass sodium, chlorine, any of the ions. So you have pure water here. And so there's going to be a hydrostatic pressure that will equilibrate, but you're going to have a higher osmotic pressure. So water is going to want to pass in and go into the salt water. It's kind of exactly the opposite of what you want to do. It's going to be making more salt water. But then what you're going to do is you're going to press on this piston with a pressure. And if you make the pressure higher than the osmotic pressure, you can actually cause the water to flow out of this region in pure water. The salt won't come with it. You'll get pure water will come in, and you'll basically have pure water coming out of your tap. But you have to be able to press on it pretty hard. We found, 7 atmospheres for some of those blood proteins, and if you calculated the total osmotic pressure of the water in the oceans, I mean, it's pretty high. It's whatever point, it's around 0.3 or 0.5 milliosmol, no, 300, say 300 to 500 milliosmol, whatever that translates into osmotic pressure. It's the amount of pressure you got to push. But if you do, you can get pure water. So it's one way. It's called ultrafiltration, or you can call it reverse osmosis. This is a way to get pure water, but you have to have the pressure higher than the osmotic pressure. Okay, a few other things about the homework in Chapter 5. 5.1, we didn't talk about problem 5.1. You're estimating from a figure. So let me show you figure 5.1. Here's figure 5.1 in the book. It's got a channel across through a membrane, and it's got these little water molecules and some big protein molecules. Now the question is this a true 2-scale picture, or did Russ Hobby and I fake it just to make it easier to draw? So what you know is you got to figure out how big a water molecule is, and you figure out how thick a membrane is, and then you can estimate how many water molecules could fit across a membrane, and you can see whether the picture got it right or not. I won't tell you whether it did or didn't, but that's the basic idea. Is this realistic, or is this sort of fake? I will let you decide that. So that's all problem 1 asks. And problem 5.7 might be one of the most interesting. This is a real story. They wanted to give a 5% solution of albumin to a patient with kidney disease. 5%. They had 5%. They didn't have any 5% solution at the hospital. All they had is 25% solution of albumin. So what they did is they took the 25% solution of albumin, and they took 4 liters of water, and they mixed them together. Now you have 5% albumin. Here's the critical problem. Usually when you make albumin solution, you add albumin to saline. But what the hospital did is it took 4 liters of pure water and mixed it together with 25% albumin and saline. Now guess what happens? The total osmotic pressure gets all screwed up. What they really should have done is they should have taken 4 liters of saline and mixed the 25% albumin solution in it. You could have had a reasonable osmotic pressure. They had their osmotic pressure way, way off. They gave it to the patient. Patient died. So that problem in problem number 7 really asks you to calculate what sort of osmotic pressure the doctors gave to the patient. And it's just really, it's a warning. You have to know your basic physics, and you have to understand the osmotic pressure so you don't make some horrible accident like that where you get the osmotic pressure all screwed up. All right, so that is pretty much what we have today. We will continue on Chapter 5 and talk about countercurrent exchange next class. That will be our main topic. And we have homework due on Friday, and I'll see you on Friday.